All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Bryant. I'm one of the school counselors at Cheltenham High School. Also on is Miss Martin, who's also another fabulous counselor at Cheltenham High School. Thank you for joining us this evening. Tonight, we have Ms. Carol Iben, who is joining us from Penn State as the Director of Financial Aid. She's been kind enough to do this every year for us and gives lots of great information. If you miss anything, this is being recorded and then eventually will be put on the counselor or webpage for presentations. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a little Q&A bubble. If you have questions as this is going on, Ms. Martin and I will be grabbing those questions and asking them as Ms. Iben's presenting. And there will be an opportunity at the end of this presentation to ask questions as well. So Ms. Iben, thank you again for coming. The floor is yours.
Thanks so much for having me. Welcome, everyone. I'm hoping that I can help demystify the financial aid process for you, help you maybe feel a little bit less stressed, especially if you are seniors or parents of seniors. So let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to cover some of the financial aid terms that colleges and universities use. We'll talk about the FAFSA, cost of attendance, expected family contribution, how schools determine financial need, various categories, types, and sources of financial aid. We'll talk about a timeline, when to do what, and just a little bit at the end about 529 college savings plans. So first, let's start with the FAFSA, the dreaded word, right? So the FAFSA is the free application for federal student aid. It is a federal form. It's used to collect both student and parent information to determine what a student may be eligible for in various forms of financial aid. So the FAFSA opened October 1. You can go to studentaid.gov to complete it online. So what kind of information do you need to have on hand? Well, you want to have information from 2020. FAFSA is always looking essentially 2 years behind when it's asking you questions about tax status, whether or not parents filed a tax return, student income, parent income. And as you're trying to discern whose information needs to go into the FAFSA, it should be both student and parents. However, if a student's parents are divorced, the student is then going to report on the parent they lived with most in the 12 months leading up to when they're sitting down to do the FAFSA. If that parent has remarried, that new spouse's information needs to be reported as well. So I just like to point that out because that's a very common situation and can sometimes trip people up a little bit. The other types of financial information you need to have on hand are things like untaxed income, child support, workers' comp, things like that, as well as your asset information. So think checking account, savings account information, 529 college savings plans if you happen to have that set up, investments. There are certain things that you are not going to report in the FAFSA. The value of your primary home if you are a homeowner, 401 retirement funds, 401k retirement funds, life insurance policies. Those are examples of things you do not need to complete the FAFSA. So we recommend that both a student and parent sit down and complete the FAFSA together. FAFSA has improved quite a bit in recent years. You can now actually file your FAFSA, submit all of the information right on your mobile device, on your cell phone. But I think for first-time FAFSA filers, it's really helpful to do it on a computer, do it on a laptop. Having that bigger screen is just really helpful to be able to take advantage of all of the screens and all of the features and just be able to have that bigger visual. There are lots of good help features inside the FAFSA. For example, they've added a chat feature where you can just type in your question and get an answer in real time. They've also got extra help when you hover over a particular question. You can get extra information about where to find that answer. For example, if the question is, what was the parent's adjusted gross income for 2020? And you hover over that particular question, it would let you know, okay, refer to line 7 or whatever on the IRS 1040. So it will direct you where to get that information. Even better, though, is if you are able to use the IRS data retrieval tool inside the FAFSA. So this is an option that you'll see as you're indicating that you may have been a tax filer, and it will allow you to have your information imported straight from the IRS right into your FAFSA so that you don't have to worry, are you getting the right information from your tax return? Are you typing it in correctly? Using this data retrieval tool not only helps ensure that your answers are more accurate, it may also reduce the chances that you get selected to provide verification, extra documents to the various schools that your student is applying to. So very helpful. Not everyone can use this data retrieval tool. So for example, if parents are married but filing separately, the tool can't pull in 2 tax returns. So there are some situations where, yep, you're just going to have to sit down and hand type in the answers that the FAFSA is asking you for. So students can select 10 colleges at a time to receive their FAFSA information. So there's a drop-down menu that allows you to select all the schools that your student is considering. Let's say you have a student who's looking at more than 10 colleges and universities, no problem. Do the first batch of 10, send that out by hitting submit, then go back in, select update schools, add the new schools that you would also like to receive the FAFSA, and hit submit and send again. That way you can do multiple schools all at one time. Now, both a parent, just one parent, and student must electronically sign the FAFSA. So to do that, you'll have to create a federal student aid ID and password. So that's one federal student aid ID and password for the student and one for the parent. It's really important to hang on to those. Like all types of things online, you can reset forgotten passwords and things like that. But the federal system is a little bit more finicky, so it takes just a little bit longer to have to reset those things. So better for you to have a folder, a binder, an area where you're keeping all of your college financial information together. Hang on to that FSA ID and password to make it easy on yourself in the future, because you need to do the FAFSA every year.
All right, 2 questions.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, the first one is, do other children's income, not students applying to the college, need to be reported on the FAFSA or CSS profile?
Definitely not in the FAFSA. I don't believe in the CSS profile either. So it is parent information and the student going to college. Now, you will need to enter the number of members in the parent's household. So those other siblings would get counted in that household number. And there's a question to ask if any of those siblings are also going to college, because that can have an impact on financial aid eligibility, but not the other students or siblings' income. That does not go in the FAFSA.
Thank you. And question 2 of 3, 2 of 4. If you have 2 previous college students, do I need to fill the FAFSA for my current student using a different email or login than used previously?
You should be able to use the same federal student aid ID and password, especially if you created it within the last probably 3 to 4 years. If it's been longer ago than that you completed a FAFSA for your older children, it is possible that you might have to create a new one, if again, some time has lapsed.
3 out of 4. Do Roth IRAs get included in reported assets?
No, they would not be included in the FAFSA information.
Last question, what if you are on extension for the 2020 tax year? I assume using the 2019 tax information is acceptable.
Well, you can complete the FAFSA using estimates, but you do have to go back in once your 2020 tax return is complete. Now, most people, even if you did an extension, that probably means you only have until October 15th to complete your 2020 tax return. So you may want to just wait, file that tax return, and then immediately after, go ahead and do the FAFSA so that you don't have to go back in and make corrections. So it is possible to correct information in the FAFSA or use estimates for the time being, but much neater and cleaner if you can wait till you actually file and then use that information.
Awesome. Thank you. That's it.
Okay. All right. A lot of good questions here. Okay. So when you're answering all these questions in the FAFSA, including income, assets, number in the household, number going to college, all of these various things go through the federal formula, and the FAFSA generates what's called an expected family contribution, or EFC for short. Poorly named, in my humble opinion, because it makes you think that's what you're going to be expected to pay. It's not. It's really just an index that colleges and universities use to determine what financial aid your student is eligible for. So that EFC number stays the same regardless of whatever college you are looking at. So obviously colleges' cost of attendance, their tuition and so on varies quite a bit from school to school, but that EFC number is the same. So schools are all receiving identical FAFSA information and then doing their best to see how much financial aid they may be able to provide with your student. There is a way to get an early EFC estimate if you want. You can go to the studentaid.gov site and use their Fafsa Forecaster. It doesn't save any of the information. It's not submitting a FAFSA, but it can give you a preview. For example, someone who may not have complete tax information yet from 2020 could go in there and just use this as an estimate to try and get an idea what their student might be eligible for in various forms of federal aid. So with COVID, with everything going on in the world the last year and a half, 2 years, a lot of folks are asking, well, you're asking to put 2020 information into the FAFSA. A lot has changed since then, and that could be your situation. So you are required to report 2020 information. But if you had a change in financial circumstances, let's say a decrease in parent income, it's worth it for you to reach out to all of the student aid offices that your student is considering. Schools will take that information about more recent changes than what you had to report, the 2020 numbers. They may be able to offer your student additional financial aid. They may be able to use 2021 tax information after you file that early next year. So schools have the ability to adjust your FAFSA using what's called professional judgment. Again, they would do that if that might result in additional aid for your student. Sometimes the circumstances are not significant enough to cause a school to make changes to what they're planning to offer you in financial aid, but it can't hurt to ask. So next, we're going to talk about this term that financial aid offices use often, cost of attendance. So cost of attendance is composed of direct costs and indirect costs. Direct costs are things the school is going to directly bill your student for. Tuition and fees, and if your student is living on campus, room and board, which is housing and meals. Indirect costs would include things like books, transportation, miscellaneous costs, which cover everything from toiletries to entertainment and things like that. So every school develops a cost of attendance. And of course, as you can imagine, it varies widely from college to college. All colleges who provide federal aid are required to have a net price calculator, which gives you this kind of information. I highly encourage you to go onto the websites of the schools that your children and you students are considering to look at their net price calculators. Some are very sophisticated and will ask you to input your EFC from the FAFSA if you know what that is. And they can calculate using this net price calculator on their website what you may be eligible for at their school. Some of them may have GPA questions and things like that, so they may be able to even give you a preview of scholarships you might be eligible for at that particular school. So again, it's worth it to take a look to see those various price points. You never want to cross off any college, certainly not at this stage of the game. If you're, say, a high school senior or a parent of a high school senior, just based on what you're finding on the net price calculator. But again, it can give you a little bit more insight as to ballpark and, what you're looking at in terms of total cost, even before you get the school's financial aid information. So schools will take their cost of attendance, they will subtract your expected family contribution number off the FAFSA, and the difference between those is considered your financial need. And as I mentioned before, schools will do a varying job of trying to meet that financial need. So let's talk about some of the different types of financial aid that you might see.
Quick question, sorry. Your jurisdiction falls under the Hurricane Ida IRS extension through January 2022.
Got it. So that, may give an added twist there. So yes, you could certainly file the FAFSA with estimates, and then you will want to go back in and update after things are finalized, whatever point in time that is. Yes.
And then also, does living off campus affect financial aid?
It depends. Different schools handle that differently. For some, the estimates for room and board, which is, if a student is living on campus and has a meal plan, and the off-campus rent estimate and what a student might spend on food are often pretty similar. So it can depend on the geographic area of the school, how much they charge for housing and things like that. But for the most part, schools really aren't going to be offering dramatically different financial aid for a student who checks off on the FAFSA that they plan to live on campus or plan to live in an off-campus apartment.
Thank you.
All right, so getting back to what types of financial aid a student could be offered as a result of filing a FAFSA, well, federal aid, of course. The primary source of federal aid is the Pell Grant, or in terms of free aid. The maximum that students could receive during this current academic year is $6,495. So a typical school that's operating on a fall and spring semester basis would split that in half. Half of that Pell Grant would be available for the fall, half of it would be available for the spring. The federal government also provides direct student loans, subsidized and unsubsidized. I'll talk a little bit more about those in just a minute. Work study is an opportunity for students to have a campus job. It just refers to the fact that it's funded by federal dollars. Lots of campus employment opportunities on a typical college campus. Not all of them are federally funded, but some are. And then there's a loan option for parents that's actually a federal form of financial aid called the Parent Plus loan. On the state side, it's things like the Pennsylvania State Grant for PA residents. And then on the institutional side, of course, scholarships and grants, the free money that doesn't need to be repaid. So talking a little bit about scholarships, as you probably know, they're typically awarded based on academic merit or other specific skills. Many scholarships do require applications, essays, sometimes videos, letters of recommendation, and there's so many different sources of scholarships. It could be through the colleges themselves, through parents, employers, often community organizations, so think nonprofits, big corporations and things like that. I've got some of the scholarship searches that you can check. Fastweb.com is one of the few .coms that we recommend. Great way to filter on various characteristics that might be true of a student to help winnow out some of the many scholarships that appear to be more general or more like sweepstakes sometimes. There are some cautions about applying for scholarships. Some red flags that scholarships might not be legit would be things like if a student is being asked to pay to apply for the scholarship. Avoid those, it's probably a scam. Or if they're asking for too much invasive information, think social security number and things like that. Those would be red flags that it's probably not something that your student wants to apply for. So when in doubt, high school guidance offices can be a great source of help on this, trying to discern what are legitimate scholarships and what might just be, phishing attempts to get students' email addresses and send them lots of spam and things like that. And colleges too, we can help vet some of those outside scholarships that you might be looking for. The ones that are listed here are, again, mainly search engines for scholarships. I will point out that one is an app with a fee, Scholly, developed by a Philadelphia area college student. I do hear personally that a lot of students like that particular app because it does help, tailor the scholarship opportunities to the things the student has self-identified in terms of categories and things like that.
Okay, we have two questions.
Sure.
Can my student loans impact my child's aid eligibility?
Not for things like grants and their federal student loans that they're going to be offered as a result of doing the FAFSA. The only possible scenario where a parent's outstanding loans could perhaps impact the student is in the loan arena. So if a parent, for example, has a lot of unpaid debt and the student is applying for an educational loan through a bank, let's say, and the parent is a cosigner. Well, if that debt to income ratio is too high, the bank might not approve a student in that scenario.
Okay, and if parents are divorced with joint custody, does it matter which parent fills out the FAFSA, especially if the parents alternate claiming the student as a dependent when filing taxes?
Okay, that's a great question. So with that divorce situation, like I mentioned in the beginning, the first question is, who does the student live with most or has lived with most in the 12 months leading up to when the FAFSA is being completed? So let's say it's a 50-50 sharing arrangement and the student spends half of the year with mom, half of the year with dad, or some arrangement like that. Then the next question is, which parent provided the most financial support in the 12 months leading up to when the parent and student sit down to do the FAFSA? And it would be that parent. So again, first question is, who did the student live with most? If that's really toss up and you really can't divvy it up, some people will say, well, there's 365 days in the year, so one parent had slightly more, but otherwise you're going with the parent who provided the student with the most financial support. So notice it didn't have any bearing on who claims the student on their tax return. Oh, I think you're muted, Ms. Martin.
Sorry. Yeah, so we actually have one more.
Okay.
I thought all college students were eligible for a loan from the government that would not need to be repaid once the student is out of school. For example, college, master's, PhD. I think the total was 20K.
Okay, so let me move forward and see if I'm getting closer to loans. So I'm going to table that question just for a little bit. And I think when I go through that slide, it'll hopefully answer it. And if not, just flag me down. So on the state grant, on the state side, there's a Pennsylvania state grant for students who are attending Pennsylvania colleges. So PA residents who qualify financially can get additional money. Grant money means, again, free money, doesn't need to be repaid. And it really depends, again, on the information in the FAFSA, but FIA, Pennsylvania Higher Education Assistance Agency, who provides this state grant, has their own additional questions they ask of Pennsylvania residents. So you'll want to complete the FAFSA. You may need to pause and take a breath. It'll take you like 20, 30 minutes to do the FAFSA. There's a tiny little link at the very end of the FAFSA that says, do you want to continue on to the state grant application? I encourage you to do that and get it done all in one fell swoop. But if you don't, if you've done the FAFSA and you missed the little link, you can always go directly to the FIA website, fia.org, and complete the state grant application there. So Pennsylvania students who have an EFC number of roughly 12,000 and below typically qualify for some level of state grant funding. And it is on a sliding scale based on their EFC. So the grants can vary, typically, $500 to $4,000 per year, again, chopped in half per semester, depending on that information in the FAFSA. That Pennsylvania state grant does not typically cross the border to go to other states. There are a couple exceptions. It can go to West Virginia, but other than that, not any of the other states that are contiguous to Pennsylvania. There is one important note about the Pennsylvania state grant. You have to file the FAFSA each year, as I've mentioned, but in the case of the state grant, you absolutely have to make sure you have filed that FAFSA before May 1st in order to be considered. If you file the FAFSA on May 2nd, they're not going to consider your student for the Pennsylvania state grant. So now we'll talk about student loans and hopefully answer some questions about that. So students are offered federal student loan funding by completing the FAFSA and meeting the very basic eligibility criteria. So things like being a US citizen or permanent resident, and not having any prior loans in default and things like that. So very basic minimal criteria. The typical first year student is going to be offered federal student loans as a result of filing a FAFSA. They're going to be offered $5,500 as a first year student. So again, thinking about, that semester situation, that means $2,750 available in the fall, $2,750 available in the spring. So it's not a lot of loan money. The advantage to the federal student loans is the interest rate is lower than what students can get from other outside lenders. This year, the interest rate is 3.73%, and it is a fixed rate over the entire life of the loan. So loans taken out this year are always going to be at that interest rate. It's not going to go up and down with the market like a variable rate would. The origination fee is a little over 1%. That represents the amount the federal government takes right off the top of the loan for its cost of providing the loan. The net amount is what's available to the student on their semester bills, for example. So students may find that all $5,500 that they are offered as a freshman could be in the unsubsidized category, or they could see that up to $3,500 of the $5,500 is offered in the subsidized category. What that means is if it is in the subsidized type, the government is paying the interest for the student on the subsidized loan the whole time they're in college. So it's interest-free while the student is in school. After they get out of school and enter repayment of that loan, then it has interest accruing on it even as they are paying it off. But that's the other advantage if a student happens to qualify. Again, it's a financial qualification thing based on the FAFSA. If they get that subsidized loan offered, that's, again, something that bank credit union can't match. So in terms of the question about our students automatically offered $20,000, that sounds like the level that a grad student would be offered. So that's a student who's already completed their 4-year bachelor's degree and has gone on for an advanced degree. That student can complete a FAFSA and be offered up to $20,500 a year in federal student loan funding. In terms of anything being automatically forgiven or written off, I would say stay tuned. That's very much in discussion right now. In DC and Washington, Congress is really trying to, get a handle on what's going on with the public service loan forgiveness program, which is for graduates who end up going into fields like teaching, education, law enforcement, and things like that, various forms of public service for community organizations and things like that. But it's very much up in the air, very uncertain. So I wouldn't hang my hat on any automatic loan forgiveness at this moment in time until more is determined at the federal level. So I've talked about federal student loans. Some families may see that, wow, $5,500, that's not enough to cover my son or daughter's costs of going to college. I'm going to need more loan money. Well, if that's your scenario, you could consider private alternative loans. So those are from an educational lender, think banks, credit unions. The rates and terms vary quite a bit. And the actual interest rate and repayment and everything else that's offered to the student is going to depend on the strength of the student's cosigner for that private alternative loan. Students are not able to apply for these types of loans with a bank or a credit union on their own. They'll get turned down. So they need a cosigner, someone who has good credit. Doesn't have to be a parent. That's probably the most common scenario. But again, that cosigner's credit history is what determines what the student is offered in terms of an interest rate and the terms and conditions for that loan. So it's worth it to shop around. Lots of good online comparison tools so that you can really get a handle just looking things up online before filling in an application. So students can borrow up to that cost of attendance minus any other financial aid that they may be receiving, like the federal student loans or scholarships or things like that. So what do loans look like after college? Well, for the federal student loans, again, the ones that are offered because the student completed the FAFSA and took those out, they have a standard repayment plan of 10 years. You can get an extended repayment plan, but stretching it out makes it more expensive. You'll have paid more in interest over the long haul. So for many families, for many students, it's better to stick to the 10-year repayment plan and ideally pay it off much sooner than that and save yourself a lot of interest. So students could expect to pay about $100 a month for every $10,000 they borrow in federal student loans. So let's say over a student's 4-year bachelor's degree, college education, they've taken out $30,000 in federal student loan funding. they would be expecting to pay roughly $300 a month for 120 months if they're on the 10-year plan. So when parents and families meet with us and we in the financial aid are trying to make sure that they don't overborrow, we offer this rule of thumb. Students shouldn't borrow more for their college degree, again, the bachelor's degree, than they expect to earn their first year out of college. And you might say, well, I have no idea what my student's going to be earning. I don't even know what their major is going to be. That's true, but you can look up various ranges for what a student's salary could be their first year out of school, depending on various professions, schools, and things like that. So you can get a range. So for example, if you find that your student is looking at an occupation where they may earn $45,000 their first year out of college, and they have taken out $60,000, $70,000, or $80,000 worth of loans, they're going to struggle to repay that loan debt. So just something to keep in mind as you're kind of trying to figure out, what's the ultimate goal and how much is too much. So we talked about—
2 questions for you.
Oh, sure. Go ahead.
If parents have a high income, such as 6 figures or over $250,000, are kids eligible for financial aid?
So that's an excellent question. Students will be offered the federal student loans, the $5,500 as a freshman, goes up a little bit as they progress through school, $6,500 for a sophomore, $7,500 for a junior and senior. That's regardless of parent income. So it's just the student completing the FAFSA, submitting it every year. They will be offered unsubsidized loans, so they won't have anywhere the government is paying the interest for them while they're in school. But again, they're still getting the advantage of that lower interest rate than they may be able to get from a bank or a credit union. So, still worth it perhaps for that student and parent to file the FAFSA just to get that federal student loan funding offered. It can always be declined. It's not an obligation. Just because you fill in a FAFSA doesn't mean you need to take the federal student loans. But yes, they will be offered regardless of the parent's income.
And question 2 of 2, does repayment get deferred if they go directly to grad school?
Yes, repayment on federal student loans can be deferred when the student goes to grad school. Keep in mind that interest may continue to accrue on that loan funding while they are in grad school and perhaps taking out additional loan funding. So it is something to be cautious about, but yes, it can be deferred.
Thank you.
All right. So we talked about the federal student loans. We talked about the private alternative loans from a bank or a credit union. And now we're going to just briefly touch on the federal Parent Plus loan. So a parent or step parent can apply for the Parent Plus loan. Doesn't have to be the parent on the FAFSA, but it does need to be, again, biological, adoptive, or step parent applying. And they can get an answer really quickly doing the online application at studentaid.gov. So they find out right away whether they're approved or denied. Typically, the time frame to do these applications, though, is after the spring of senior year. So once you've already made your college decision. So parents are typically approved if there's no adverse credit history. So sometimes it can be slightly easier to qualify for a federal Parent Plus loan. And there's a unique situation with the Parent Plus loan where if the parent is denied, let's say there is an adverse credit history on the parent's record, the student will be offered $4,000 more in their federal student loans. It would be unsubsidized. So in the case of a first-year student, a freshman, who's been offered $5,500. If the parent applies for the plus loan, gets turned down, that student will now be offered a total of $9,500 for their freshman year. Interest rate is 6.28%, so they charge more for parents taking out the Parent Plus loan, and the government takes a heftier origination fee than they do off the student loans. It's a little over 4%. That comes right off the top. The student gets the net amount to assist them with their expenses. Parents can choose to either begin repaying that Plus loan right away, or they can defer it until their student leaves school. Again, it's got interest accruing on it, if they are deferring it. And repayment of the Parent Plus loan can't be legally transferred to the student, so it does remain the student's responsibility. Parents' responsibility. I'm so sorry. Okay, so let's hit the timeline. Let's say you are in senior year, fall of senior year. Now is the time that you are applying to colleges, completing those admission applications, and hopefully getting ready to sit down and complete the FAFSA as well. So again, you want to go to studentaid.gov to complete it, and know that some schools have priority FAFSA filing deadlines on their websites. What this means is they will give priority consideration for certain forms of perhaps university or college grants to students who file their FAFSA by that deadline. It's worth it for you to go to those schools' websites that your students are considering to look to see, do they have a priority filing deadline? Penn State, for example, has a December 1st priority filing deadline. So if there are forms of grant aid that we have limited quantities of, we're going to award that first to students who have met that early filing deadline. Will we still offer financial aid to students who submit a FAFSA after December 1? Absolutely. But again, they may not get as much consideration as a student who is completing the FAFSA by our priority deadline. Now, I've focused a lot of time on the FAFSA and federal aid, but be aware that there is also another financial aid application that you may need to complete. There are about 400 colleges and universities throughout the country that use the Css Profile, in addition to the FAFSA, to determine how they are going to award their institutional aid. So think scholarships and need-based grants. So you would find this out on the school's website. They would let you know if they are a CSS Profile school. So the CSS Profile will take a little longer than a FAFSA to complete. It's a little bit more intrusive. It will ask for more information. For example, in the situation of divorced parents, it's going to ask for both parents' information, not just the parent that the student lives with, things like that. So you do want to set aside some time to complete that as soon as possible. Many schools do use a priority filing deadline for that CSS profile. Again, critical if your student is looking at attending one of the 400 or so colleges and universities that use that CSS profile. The website might be kind of familiar to you because the CSS Profile folks are also the same folks who develop the SATs. So it's part of the College Board platform. So after schools get your FAFSA and perhaps your CSS Profile, if they are one of those schools, they are going to determine what your student is eligible for in these various forms of financial aid. And they're going to provide your student with a financial aid award package, a summary of what your student is being offered from their institution. Those typically go out between December and early March. Most schools are going to provide your student with a link to open it up online. Usually there's a nice printable version of it as well, but don't wait around for the financial aid information to come through regular mail. Some schools will send you that as well. But it's important to have either a designated email set up where your student's going to be able to receive all of this financial aid information, and that they are parents communicating with you so that you will know as financial aid packages come in so that you can view them with your student. May 1 is the college decision deadline. So that means you've got lots of time to take a look at these various financial aid summaries and take that into consideration as you're making that all-important college decision. So I have just a brief comparison for you. Often we hear students are struggling to figure out what's their best decision from a financial perspective. Of course, there are lots of things to consider with a college decision: fit, academics, reputation, all of those kinds of things. But from a financial perspective, I just want to take a few moments to compare college A and college B. You might be doing this with multiple schools and kind of putting them all out on the table, looking at the financial aid summaries that you've been presented from each school to try and make your decisions. So college A, let's say their tuition is roughly $40,000 and your student has qualified for a $20,000 scholarship. That's great, right? Sounds wonderful. Maybe your student is taking out the federal student loan because they did the FAFSA. So the amount left to cover is $14,500. Let's say your student is also considering another college. Maybe the tuition there is $15,000. Maybe they've only been offered a $1,000 scholarship there. And once again, they're taking out the federal student loan funding. But the bottom line for the student to pay is $7,500. So as you're comparing things, you do want to keep in mind what your ultimate out-of-pocket costs are going to be. What is that school expecting you to pay or borrow, not only for year 1, but for years 2, 3, and 4. So all of that is, part of your decision-making process as you're trying to make those, again, all important college decisions. So as I wrap up and allow some time for questions, I just wanted to briefly touch on 529s. These are savings plans that can be set up in the years before college. There are certain state income tax breaks for contributions to the plan, so it's worth it to look at the Pennsylvania 529 website. You can take tax-free withdrawals if the funding is going to be spent for education. So I do want to point that out because that can be a helpful vehicle for some families. So I lastly wanted to point out a really helpful resource, an online guide that is produced by FHIA, Pennsylvania Higher Education Assistance Agency. You can go onto their website, go to the college planning tab, and you can check out their student aid guide. It's really helpful, not just about the state grant. It talks about federal aid, talks about various colleges and universities, and really just gives you an overall view of financial aid, not only for the first year, but as you're planning for all 4 years. So I do recommend that as a very helpful guide to refer to. So now I'm happy to take any other questions that may have come up in the chat. And I've got my email address. So let's say you think about something next week, or you go to sit down and do the FAFSA. I would be glad to answer your questions by email. If I don't know the answer, I'll research it and then get back to you.
Okay, we do have 3 questions right now.
Okay.
One is, if you decline the $5,500 the first year, are you still eligible for financial aid in the subsequent years?
That's an excellent question. So you have to keep doing the FAFSA every year. So this year, again, if students are in fall of senior year, you're on it, you're doing the FAFSA right away. You want to remember to do the FAFSA for all of their subsequent years as well. You'll have a little bit more time. You won't have to rush and do it, before, December 1, let's say. But it is important to do it. Unused loan funding or even grants for that matter, if that would be possible. Anything that's unused in freshman year doesn't roll over to the next year. So if you decline the loans, you don't need them for freshman year, and then sophomore year comes around and, oh, you wish you had that money, available to you. Nope, you just have what's offered for sophomore year, which for the typical student who's got 30 completed credits after the end of freshman year, they're going to be offered $6,500 in federal student loans as a sophomore. So yeah, that is one thing that, if you're not taking advantage of the loan funding, that's fine. If you don't need it, great, but it doesn't roll over.
Okay, and I'm going to combine two other questions. What does CSS mean, and where on the school's website would you find that information?
All right. So yeah, you're putting me on the spot about that acronym. I'm not quite sure the CSS profile, but it is a financial aid application. So you would go to the tuition and financial aid page of the various schools that your student is considering to see if they are a CSS profile school. If they are, it will be clearly presented on their website. When in doubt, you can always call or email the student aid office at that institution if you want to just, double check, or you're not quite sure if they require it. But generally, they have it very, very clearly presented that you need to do not only the FAFSA, but the CSS profile for consideration of their institutional aid.
Okay, and I've heard of colleges offering large financial aid packages to freshman students to lure them in and then greatly reduce the aid the following years. Is this a common practice?
I don't know that I would say it's a common practice, but it is certainly worth inquiring. So if you are reviewing that financial aid package and you'd like to know, well, what does it look like in years 2, 3, and 4? Certainly lots of questions you can ask. You can ask the question by saying, if my FAFSA information is pretty similar for my student's second year, can I expect the same level of aid, or is something going to change? The other thing is, if part of that wonderful freshman package is offered in scholarship terms, there should be a scholarship letter or scholarship details that clearly spell out, are there conditions that need to be met for the student to keep getting that scholarship in successive years, or is it truly a one-time, one-year award? So schools should disclose that information up front with you, but if they haven't, or you need reassurance, it can't hurt to contact that financial aid office and get that answered.
Is there any advice that you give parents of juniors to help prepare for this process?
It's never too early to look for scholarships. So high school juniors and seniors can certainly be, doing that even before they begin to apply for admissions to various colleges and universities. Because again, a lot of scholarships are offered from companies and nonprofits and things like that. So that's one way that juniors can be proactively involved in applying for scholarships. And even if they aren't eligible for particular scholarships that early on, they can certainly map out the deadlines for various scholarships and when they may want to do them, say in spring of junior year or fall of senior year. So definitely worthwhile. Otherwise, just keeping good grades, because that can make a huge difference as students are considering various schools. Having a strong GPA can really make the difference in terms of academic merit scholarships.
How do you apply PA 529 funds to your college bill?
So every school will have their own process for this. Basically, it just involves deciding whether you are going to have the funding sent directly to the school or whether you're going to have the 529 plan send you the money and you will then turn around and pay the school. Generally, it's better tax-wise to keep things easy to track and easy to confirm should you ever be audited, to have the 529 plan send it straight to the school. So you initiate that contact with whoever the 529 plan is, let them know your student is enrolled, provide whatever information they need so that they can make that payment out directly to the school.
Once May 1st arrives and the colleges know its yield for the incoming class, does the financial aid to students who chose another college go back to the pot? In other words, do college financial aid offices have wiggle room on a financial aid package post May 1st? Should they reach out to the financial aid again? And thank you for your time.
So that's a good question. Most colleges and universities go out with far more in scholarship awards than they will have students who deposit, and they calculate that out. They may look at historical trends of what percentage of their students applicants end up enrolling. So they've kind of already calculated that out. So for many of them, they're done spending if they hit their targets. Now, perhaps if they didn't hit their enrollment numbers, maybe there might be some wiggle room. If there's a change in family financial circumstances, that's absolutely a time to contact a college or university, even after you've made a deposit decision, for example, and see if there is any more funding available to help your student. But in general, schools are not typically recycling unspent scholarship dollars because, again, they've kind of already accounted for that on the front end with how much they've offered. They just don't know which students are taking them up on their scholarship offers. If that makes sense.
Thank you. We have some comments. CSS stands for College Scholarship Service Profile. The next question was, what about certificate programs at Arcadia University?
Well, I wouldn't know about particular programs at another institution, but in general, certificate programs are not typically eligible for financial aid, federal financial aid, or state financial aid, because students do have to be degree-seeking students to be eligible for federal and state aid. So they have to either be pursuing an associate's degree, a two-year degree, or a bachelor's degree. Certificate programs usually are not part of that. So in general, I would say they are not eligible for financial aid.
Are tuition benefits offered by parents' employer included on the FAFSA?
That's a good question. I might have to research that and get back. I don't believe they are. But yeah, I'm not 100% sure on that. So I could look into that and get back. If somebody wants to email me, I can do some digging.
This session was chock full of important information. Thank you so much. And the last question that we have for now is, where do I access Fafsa Forecaster?
So it is on the studentaid.gov website. And probably the quickest way is to just type it into their search bar, and you would be able to get that. I have heard talk that they may be changing the name of that to FAFSA Simulator. So it might be in that transition phase. So you could try that as well if for some reason they've already made that switch from Fafsa Forecaster to Fafsa Simulator.
Okay. Ms. Iben, we very much appreciate your time and coming out to us yet another year. So we hope to keep you coming out. So thank you again. If you give us a few days, parents, this should be posted under the Cheltenham counselor page where it has previous presentations. So you can watch it and share it with your friends.
All right. Well, thanks so much for having me. And again, if you do have other questions that I can help with, by all means, feel free to email me at cje13@psu.edu. Thanks, everyone.